A father loses his voice, and in that silence, has forged himself into a sharp weapon of vengeance. The bloody fireworks of Christmas Eve are about to be ignited, the first step of the revenge plan. He arrives at the police station as a victim to learn about the progress of the case. While waiting for Inspector Dennis in the office, he discovers the wall behind is covered with photos of key gang members. Some of them are even the ringleaders who caused his son's death. So, he uses his phone to photograph their information. A sketch of a bald man makes Brian pause and focus his attention. It is this bald man, Playa, the one who fired a shot that nearly took Brian's life. When the inspector enters the office, he sees Brian about to leave. From Brian's eyes, the policeman seems to see a seed of hatred sprouting. Brian pastes photos of those involved in his son's death on the wall and marks the plan to eliminate them all on Christmas Day. Because that day is the first anniversary of his son's death. The revenge begins from this moment. Out of the pain of losing a child, Brian becomes increasingly resilient. He strives to train for a strong physique and even learns professional takedown moves. From struggling with initial physical exercises, he now easily handles heavy-duty combat training. He buys a dilapidated old car from a dealer. The sound of the wipers clearing the film of dust on the windshield is just like Brian's revenge goal, becoming increasingly clear. Returning home, he sets to work modifying the car. The sound of hammering nails rings out every day. His wife knows Brian is preparing to avenge their son. She understands, but cannot stop him. Having a strong body is one thing, but without accurate shooting skills, he cannot punish evil. After a round of practice with terrible results, he meticulously studies firearms. The wife also gradually explodes after days of standing on the brink of collapse. That night, they held each other for comfort all night without saying a word. The wife understands her husband, and the husband understands even more clearly the truth that his wife is about to leave. It is not that they no longer love each other, just that perhaps being apart for a while is a better way. Wiping away tears, she picks up her luggage and walks out the door. His wife's departure also helps Brian no longer worry about what comes after. It turns out Brian once had a happy family of 3. The whole family was joyfully celebrating Christmas in the backyard when suddenly, the sound of gunfire and the horrifying screech of brakes rang out. Stray bullets from a shootout between 2 gangs flew everywhere. Brian and his wife used their bodies to shield their son. When the gangsters drove away, they only then discovered that fresh blood had stained their son's shirt red. Brian indignantly gave chase, wanting to deal with them. Listening to the noise to determine the direction, Brian found the 2 gangs still in a gunfight and rushed toward them. At this time, the 2 sides were still killing each other fiercely. The blue car faction clearly had the upper hand. After a burst of gunfire, a member of the yellow car faction was eliminated. On the crowded street, the 2 sides continued to fire at each other while the cars sped along. The next second, the yellow car hit a water pipe and lost control. The blue car gradually disappeared, and Brian at this point was even more determined to chase and kill the opponent. He found a crowbar in a pile of trash. The moment the blue car sped out of an alley, he struck it directly and forcefully, causing the car to lose control immediately. But the blow had not caused significant damage. The blue car faction began to turn back to hunt Brian in the narrow alley. He dodged bullets while fleeing. Seeing the car about to hit him, Brian leaped a great distance. The forklift attachment directly sliced off the driver's head. After a 720-degree roll, Brian fell to the ground. A gangster holding a gun stepped out of the car and shot Brian directly in the hip. This man was the leader of the Playa gang. Playa did not let Brian go because of that. He slowly raised his gun, shot Brian in the neck once more, then leisurely walked away. The scene shifts to the hospital. Perhaps out of curiosity to know if Brian was still alive, Dennis stopped by to leave his business card and then left. Since Brian was hospitalized, every day a parrot appeared outside his hospital room window, keeping watch over him. It seemed as if the deceased son had been reincarnated into that parrot, constantly praying for Brian to wake up soon. The prayer was quickly answered. His wife cared for him devotedly day and night, and the parrot came to the window every day to watch over him. Brian gradually began the process of physical rehabilitation. Because his vocal cords were severely damaged, he permanently lost the ability to speak, feeling like he was in a nightmare, wanting to scream but unable to utter a word. Just home, Christmas memories rushed back to Brian. His wife hugged her husband from behind to comfort him. The soccer ball in the yard had deflated, and even everything in the house remained exactly as it was on that fateful Christmas day. There were still the gifts the son hadn't had time to unwrap. The pain in his heart made Brian unable to restrain himself any longer. This is the ultimate pain for a father who loved his child dearly, a tragic state of mind that few can understand. Seeing the newspaper on the table reporting on his son's death, It turned out that just because two gangs were fighting over territory, a young boy died unjustly from a stray bullet. This made Brian even more indignant. He took a bottle of white liquor from the fridge and gulped down large mouthfuls. The wife quietly watched Brian vent his frustration. But then the pain and suppression of the past months within her also exploded. No mother who has lost a child can appear resilient forever. So, Brian locked himself in the basement every day, immersed in alcohol and the grief of losing his son. Suddenly one day, in a drunken stupor, he thought of his son. He couldn't let himself be submerged like this forever. The seed of revenge began to sprout. Soon it was October, with only more than 2 months until Christmas. Late at night, Brian worked diligently to collect evidence of the gang's crimes. At this time, Brian's opponents were not just a few petty criminals, but all members of both gangs. Brian tried to record every criminal image of Playa, but he quickly disappeared from sight. Then he discovered a man named Anthony carrying a suitcase out of a building and getting into a car. Thanksgiving quickly arrived. Brian frantically intensified his training. Now, Brian's physique was no longer that of a weakling, but had become a man with rippling muscles. Every criminal on the wall was a motivation forcing him to be stronger, even the most difficult car drifting techniques. After several months of daily practice, he handled them skillfully. Shooting skills switched from left hand to right hand. Hitting the bullseye every time was no longer an issue. Each bullet tearing through the center of the target on the screen further consolidated Brian's determination for revenge. It was the reward for his efforts over the past months. The revenge was about to begin. Late at night, Brian climbed through the window and broke directly into Anthony's house. Hearing a noise, Anthony went to check, only to be unexpectedly ambushed by Brian. Anthony was beaten, dazed, and tumbled down the stairs. The scene shifts to the image of Anthony tied up and hanging upside down in Brian's basement. He did not show his real face, but wore a welding mask, directly intimidating Anthony. At this moment, Anthony was no different from a roasted pig waiting for the chopping block in Brian's hands. Looking at the gang's criminal information pasted all over the wall, Anthony immediately knew he was in danger, but was even more confused as to which god of death he had offended. Brian presented pre-printed questions and forced Anthony to write the answers. These were the proofs of the gang's criminal methods and money laundering. Anthony tried to resist and was immediately threatened by Brian with a knife. This move made Anthony scared out of his pants. Brian stabbed the knife right in front of him as a warning not to try any tricks. Thinking he had submitted, Anthony suddenly untied himself and even quickly seized the knife and stabbed Brian once. The danger came so suddenly that Brian could not react in time. As a result, he received another deep knife wound to his leg. Enduring the pain, he rushed into a struggle with Anthony. For Brian, this was the first real combat, so his experience was still very green. This battle was not as easy as he imagined. Having to face a gangster who fought every day made him struggle immensely. But fortunately, thanks to a desperate counterattack and a bit of protagonist aura, he beat Anthony to a pulp. Brian won this round narrowly. Soon it was December 24th. This was the day of judgment that Brian had planned to destroy the gang. Having arranged his weapons and equipment, this was perhaps the last time Brian would see his wife. Because of the guilt toward his wife, or because he couldn't let go of his son's death, he did not meet her. Revenge is the final consolation for Brian and his wife after the pain of losing their child. Brian brought a gift that had never been opened to his son's grave. He stroked the tombstone, sitting there silently for a long time. There were so many things he wanted to say to his son, but everything was encapsulated in silence and the unceasing pain over the child's departure. As night fell, Brian dumped Anthony in front of Dennis's house along with a red envelope. Very soon after, Anthony was arrested by the police. The inspector slowly opened the envelope. All of this was a gift Brian sent to him. In the envelope, it was written that everything would end tonight. At this moment, the inspector was still bewildered. He opened the data in the USB drive from the envelope. Inside was the criminal information of the entire Playa gang. Everything Brian had investigated for months. The relationships of each character, the criminal deals, even the hideouts, transaction locations of the gang, and Anthony's confession. Everything was clear and organized. Just as Brian was about to head to Playa's hideout, he heard a police report about a robbery nearby. Brian resolutely went to investigate. Seeing the opponents were large, muscular men, he did not stop them from carrying out the robbery at that moment, but used a flanking tactic. Waiting until they left, Brian drove his car straight into those two. The heavy impact effectively incapacitated both henchmen. He drew a dagger and directly delivered a finishing blow to one opponent. The other one still clung tightly to the roof of the car. Even as Brian braked suddenly or performed frantic spinning drifts, that man refused to let go. He even tried to draw a gun to aim at Brian, but was quickly disarmed by him. After a few shots, blood slowly trickled down from the roof. The bloody scene made Brian feel momentarily horrified and uneasy. This was the first time he had taken a human life. Immediately after, he threw a package into the fenced yard. It was the severed hand of Anthony, the key man of the Playa gang. A subordinate saw the package and brought it directly to the boss. Playa discovered the severed hand. He was extremely angry, thinking it was done by Ruiz's side, so he ordered his men to go for revenge. This was Brian's ultimate plan, to ignite a war between the two gangs. At this time, the two sides were fighting fiercely. Brian was about to intervene when he discovered the police were besieged and taking casualties. Brian had the intention to save a female officer and began driving in circles around her position, firing to eliminate all gang members. Just then, a low-level thug who didn't know life from death recorded a video and transmitted it directly to Playa's phone. Seeing the skillful tail-sliding drifts and the way Brian moved as if in an empty place, Playa felt the danger as his men were taken down one by one in a hail of bullets. Having dealt with the gangsters, Brian stopped the car in front of the female officer, but as soon as she got in, she was hit by a bullet in the back. She stopped breathing. Brian had to slowly place the female officer's body on the road. Because the work he needed to do had only just begun, he stepped on the gas and ran directly into the man recording the video, snatched the phone that was still recording, and killed him instantly. This moment made Playa even more panicked. Finally, he knew who was taking revenge on them. At the same time, Playa offered a $5,000 reward in the gang's group chat for whoever could kill Brian. Shortly after, Brian found Ruiz. He didn't stop the car, but only brushed past as a provocation, then drove away. Brian stopped his car slowly on a bridge. He took out a musical accessory. Perhaps this was the only way for his soul to communicate with his deceased son. Feeling Ruiz about to catch up, Brian slammed the accelerator to speed up. Suddenly a car lunged out and hit his car hard. That was Ruiz, so the two began a dramatic chase. While racing at extremely high speed, Brian suddenly turned around and braked hard. He was using his own unique way to deal with Ruiz, using his own advantage to strike at the enemy's weakness. Very quickly, Ruiz caught up, directly forcing Brian into an alley. But this happened to be the occasion where a group of arms dealers were transacting. The next second, Brian directly rammed into their car, pushing the whole vehicle along. At this moment, being squeezed between two ends, the situation was somewhat passive. He stepped hard on the brakes to escape the car in front, and then used his gun to fire repeatedly at the enemy. After dealing with all the henchmen, now dealing with Ruiz was perhaps as easy as turning over a hand. Brian used a new skill, accelerating to the maximum to ram his car, sending him flying far away. At this time, Dennis heard the report over the police radio about the two gangs purging each other. He didn't even need to think to know it was Brian's doing. He had always been analyzing what Brian's purpose was, why on earth he was doing this. After a while of racking his brain with his not-so-quick mind, he finally remembered Brian's son's case from last year. At this time, Playa was enjoying himself with a young, beautiful woman in the dim light and melodious music. But Playa then summoned all his subordinates to return. Brian had just finished eating a grilled skewer when he received news that Playa had called everyone back to the hideout. He put on his leather jacket, posing majestically. The third round officially began. All gang members were heading toward the hideout. At this time, Brian rode his warhorse alongside and followed behind. As the rolling door was about to lower, he quickly sped his car inside. Don't underestimate Brian for being a lone wolf. His marksmanship was excellent. Seeing that a handgun wasn't enough to hold them off, he pulled out a shotgun and blew up a motorcycle leaking gasoline, creating a large explosion. Then, he quickly dealt with the gangsters on the bottom floor. After finishing the ones downstairs, he successfully made it to the rooftop. To stop the gang's reinforcements, he set up a booby trap mine. When Brian followed the noise, he encountered Ruiz again, who was not yet dead. In terms of physique, Brian was indeed a bit inferior to Ruiz, so he quickly fell into a massive disadvantage. Sure enough, as Brian predicted, the mine exploded, blowing several men away. The explosion caught Ruiz's attention, creating an opportunity for Brian to counterattack. After several shots, he still stood there. Even though Brian used a knife to stab the opponent, he did not reduce the force of his attack aimed at him. When Dennis reached the rooftop, the way was strewn with corpses. At this time, Brian and Ruiz fought all the way into the armory. Those small, flexible movements were excellent. Brian suddenly rushed into close combat with Ruiz and then took the opportunity to give him a lead candy right in the neck. Right then, the inspector unleashed a smooth series of combos, directly dealing with several gangsters. By now, Brian was wounded in many places. Just as he was checking his ammunition, the inspector slowly stepped into view. The two did not fire at each other. Brian did not dare to put down his gun, and the inspector, seeing Brian's heavy injuries, seemed to understand the heart of a father who lost a child. He slowly withdrew his gun. Suddenly, there was the sound of continuous gunfire toward the two of them. That woman had plenty of ammunition, so both fell into a passive position, and even both were hit. After an understanding look between them, they decided to split up to surround her. Brian stepped out of the shadows. The woman slowly turned around, showing a pitiful appearance that made Brian hesitate to act. The tears on her face made Brian hold back even more. When he lowered his gun, that very kindness killed him. Even the inspector, just as he was scrambling up, was hit by 2 consecutive bullets. In the end, he still had to kill the woman. Most people often have to pay the price for their own hesitation. Holding the bloody gun, Brian stepped into Playa's room. At this moment, Playa also stepped out. Brian was already seriously injured, having long lost his fighting capacity. Even though he was hit by several bullets, he was not willing to die in front of his enemy. Then he was held at gunpoint by Playa. In the moment of crisis, the inspector gave Playa a bullet,